previous lecture, we talked about the early stages of the civil rights movement. By the early 1960s, the civil rights movement was blossoming. Several different groups had formed by this period, each with its own unique membership and causes. I'll mention three of them for the moment. We'll actually mention a few others as we go along. But by the early 60s, the three most important groups were called CORE. This was the Congress of Racial Equality, which was made up largely of Northerners who were coming to the South to teach blacks how to protest, how to register to vote, and what to expect during protests and so on. SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These were the groups that initiated the sit-ins in Greensboro in 1960 that I talked about during a previous lecture. And so they are almost entirely young, black, largely male. We'll come back to SNCC a little bit later as well. And Martin Luther King's organization was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, perhaps a little bit older in constituency, male and female, added wisdom, added senior leadership to the movement. And so John F. Kennedy, I've mentioned his sort of mixed record on civil rights, but he was certainly more of a champion of civil rights than Richard Nixon was. And so it was during the campaign in 1960 that Kennedy's views on civil rights were really brought to the forefront. And a key moment came in October of 1960 as the campaign was reaching its peak, when Martin Luther King was arrested at a protest in Atlanta. And John F. Kennedy actually called the judge and pressured him to free Martin Luther King. And from that point forward, Kennedy was a great hero for blacks. As president, Kennedy did do more than previous presidents had done in terms of promoting racial equality. He appointed more blacks to federal positions than any president had before. He supported the integration of Southern schools. He worked against intimidation at the polls. And yet, as I mentioned to you, the political realities of the period and his hopes of maintaining the Southern vote prevented him from being as aggressive on the issue of civil rights as he might have liked to. So there's a final instance in which Kennedy and the civil rights movement intersect, and that is over the process that were known as the Freedom Ride. So this is kind of the next phase of the civil rights movement after the lunch counter sit-ins. They were initiated by James Farmer, who was the leader of CORE. And in essence, what the Freedom Rides did was they hoped to integrate the bus system, and principally the Greyhound bus system, the national bus system. And so the way the Freedom Rides worked was that the passengers would board a bus in a northern location or an area that was integrated, and then they would ride the bus into the South and would get off the bus at a location that was segregated. So Birmingham or Atlanta or Hattiesburg, Mississippi, or wherever it might be. Oftentimes, these buses would be greeted by a mob or a crowd of angry whites who might do any number of things. So this would have been a very interesting and I suppose tense kind of experience. These integrated groups, black and white, would board the bus somewhere in the north, and then they're riding on the bus for 10 hours or 12 hours or 14 hours. Probably early on they're excited, they're singing songs and geared up, and as they drove into the South, I would imagine an atmosphere of concern and maybe even fear set in. So there were a number of very violent incidents when these Freedom Rides reached their destination. In one incident, a mob attacked the bus, throwing an incendiary bomb, a firebomb, onto the bus, which is what you see in this picture. And then as the passengers ran out of the bus to escape the fire, they were beaten by the mob. In other incidents, the police allowed the angry mobs to have several minutes to kind of have their way with the rioters, and then the police would move in and kind of break up the attack. Eventually, the Freedom Riders reached Mississippi, and Kennedy was very concerned as to what might happen. And so Kennedy actually ordered that the rioters be arrested at the border. He didn't want them to reach their locations deep in Mississippi. And so many Freedom Riders were sent to jail where the conditions were poor, they were overcrowded, the jail keepers would turn the air conditioner way up or way down, and eventually, the pressure mounted on Kennedy and specifically on his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, remember, to try to make some change. And so by 1962, the Kennedys pressured the Greyhound bus system and other bus companies to integrate, and virtually all of them did. So this is kind of the pattern of change with the civil rights movement. It's a slow process, often very painful. There's a lot of violence. People are getting hurt and beaten and arrested, occasionally getting killed. But gradually and eventually, the changes are creeping in. Things were coming to a head by 1963, and in the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King brought the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to Birmingham, Alabama, which he called the bastion of bigotry. This is one of the most racist cities in the country. And throughout that spring, they conducted marches and did sit-ins, and they were confronted time and again by the chief of police, whose name was Bull Connor. And King ordered his police to attack the protesters with nightsticks and fire hoses, turn the police dogs upon them. And coming out of all of these various protests were many pictures that were spread across the country and have become some of the enduring pictures of the civil rights movement, like the one you see on the screen. There are a number of other pictures of the protesters being attacked with fire hoses, some of them with the police dogs, and so on. And eventually, through this sort of publicity, Birmingham was becoming the target of many comments and criticisms from all around the country. And merchants throughout the city began to break down and began to integrate as the wave of public opinion sort of crashed around them. At one point in these protests in Birmingham, Martin Luther King was arrested and spent some time in jail in Birmingham. And while he was there, he wrote one of the famous documents from the civil rights movement, and one of his own most famous documents called The Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It is in this letter that King employed the famous phrase, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." But it was words like this and the various sorts of protests that eventually brought the pressure on the city of Birmingham to make changes. So we need to understand that a couple of things are at work here. One of them is the willingness of King and other marchers to be put in jail in large numbers. The idea was they can't put all of us in jail. Eventually they're going to have to deal with this. The other idea is that it was public opinion that ultimately began to sway things and bring about the changes. And so it was important to the civil rights movement that their actions be publicized, that the photographs were taken, that video was taken and shown on the news and so on, so that people all around the country would see what was going on. We will discuss other episodes where there wasn't this kind of violent backlash, where there weren't the notorious kind of pictures that showed up in the magazines and newspapers, and less action was actually achieved. On the heels of the successful actions of early 1963, Martin Luther King organized the famous March on Washington in August of 1963. A crowd of more than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, where King delivered his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. I would imagine that you have all heard this speech, or heard parts of it anyway, on Martin Luther King Day, almost every day of your lives, or every year of your lives, since you were very young. So I would invite you to listen to that speech, especially if you haven't heard it, or go look up more information about it. It was certainly a riveting moment, and the movement seemed to be peaking. Activism was at its height. We're coming off of all of that action in Birmingham early in the year. There was tremendous attention paid to this march. King's speech captivated the entire nation, and it seemed we are on the brink of a wave of action. And then, much to everyone's dismay and horror, John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And so it seemed that all of the action that Martin Luther King and the civil rights activists had been mobilizing for, and the changes that they hoped to achieve, were now going to be dashed. John F. Kennedy, before his death, had been agitating for a civil rights bill, which was one of the ultimate goals of the civil rights movement. And now coming into the White House is Lyndon Johnson, the Texan, the big, brassy, remember, he grew up poor in Texas. And so civil rights leaders had no idea what to expect, but they were certainly crushed that Kennedy was no longer in the White House. And yet Johnson was surprisingly supportive of the kinds of programs that Kennedy had proposed. And as he entered the White House, Lyndon Johnson said about civil rights, he said, "The ideas and ideals which Kennedy so nobly represented must and will be translated into effective action."